Hi everyone, it's John. I come to you from exactly the same place as I always have, but I think 4 weeks later without a video. I don't think I've taken 4 weeks off since I came back to YouTube well over a year ago now. So all I can say is that it's been a very, very busy October. So I'm back for the time being and hope to remain weekly as usual, but occasionally life happens. So, and what better spirit to return in than a review of 20th century's perhaps most contentious thinker, and not a review of everything, just a particular book. Um, Freud, of course. Uh, this is one of his later works, as I'll explain in the body of the review. This is Civilization and its Discontents. This is the standard edition. I think the standard edition has been redone, but this is the ones that have the introduction by Peter Gay, the incredible Freudian scholar and psychohistorian, a couple of whose works himself I've actually reviewed on the channel. If you just search Peter Gay in the search bar for this channel, I think at least one book comes up, and possibly two. So, a little just word about the review. I know Freud is a pretty divisive figure. I'm not going to really say in this review how much I agree or disagree with him. I'm just going to sort of summarize the content of the book, kind of like a book report. I don't want to really, get into, Freud has been debunked because of this, this, and this. I grant you that I'm on board with it to a fair extent, but my interest in this book and my push to read it was much more driven by the fact that the ideas had been so influential, and by also just how simply interesting they are. So my interest in it and my drive to read it have really been divorced from how true the ideas are. So with that in mind, and also one more thing, if I ever use any language in the body of the review that doesn't make sense, you haven't run into, just try Googling the word or asking me what the word is. I'll try to give you a really concise, potted definition, so maybe the review makes more sense. Otherwise, here is a review of Sigmund Freud's Civilization and its Discontents. There are a handful of books, I think, by Freud that don't centrally concern themselves with the claims of the ego, the id, and the superego. That's the sort of model that Freud has for the individual psyche. If you're familiar with his sort of fundamental concepts of psychoanalysis, everyone who's somewhat familiar with Freud will tell you that's what the three parts of every human mind is made of: the ego, the id, and the superego. But rather, some of his books take on a big topic and they look at them through a psychoanalytic lens. And I think three of the best known of those books are Totem and Taboo, which comes from 1913, so around the middle of his career. The Future of an Illusion, which is from 1927, and then Moses and Monotheism, which is I believe the last full-length book that he ever wrote in 1939, right before the war breaks out. All of which discuss some facet or another of religion. The most fundamental of these books, however, is none of those three. I think it is Civilization and its Discontents, which was written in the summer of 1929. The important distinction Freud wants to confront in this book is the primal need to express the libidinousness, that is the drive, the sort of unconscious drives that we have. For those of you familiar with the id, that's where the drives are, right? To express the libidinous of the individual versus the overwhelming need of civilization to repress and to conform the individual to social, cultural standards. So, namely, Freud is really interested in knowing how humans can use their sometimes destructive drives. The death drive is what he's very interested in. He calls it Thanatos, after the god of death. And he wants to know how we can use those drives towards socially constructive ends, like how we can how we get something out of civilization when all we have individually is just a bunch of these people who have crazy drives to have sex or seek pleasure or kill themselves or inflict danger or inflict damage on others or themselves. How does civilization come out from just a bunch of people who are just so libidinously driven by these impulsive desires? Civilization in its Discontents opens with a restatement of Freud's views on religion as kind of a psychological band-aid, which you can find in his work from 2 years previous, which is, as I stated earlier, The Future of an Illusion. And then it quickly moves on to confront what he sees as the simplistic bromides and sort of easy cliches that we tell ourselves about how the ideas of progress and liberty are related to civilization. He claims that the first civilizations were able to essentially change, to transmogrify our ego-centered selfishness and the libido, which he sort of analogizes to be close to Thanatos, the death impulse, into a kind of affection that draws people together into small groups called families, and even, an idea of a larger group, which we would call humanity. But this doesn't really come without its costs. Freud thinks that we have something called the pleasure principle, which is basically what it sounds like. It's a drive to gain and seek as much pleasure as we possibly can. But this is also countered by the realization that not all pleasures can be brought to fruition. And this is the reality principle, that we can only bring a small proportion of those pleasures into our lives. So instead of pursuing pleasure, our goal is really, when we act to avoid pain or to avoid displeasure, it's sort of the negative converse of the pleasure principle. And a few of the means by which he thinks we avoid life's miseries are, for example, substance use or abuse, the deflection of efforts into pursuits that we think are more likely to be met with success, like, working really hard for that next promotion or that next job interview, because that's much more likely than some of the more pie-in-the-sky pleasures we might want to have that are much more pleasurable, but would be much less likely to attain in our lives. And the most interesting thing that he thinks that we use to sort of sublimate desires that we can't meet in our lives is religion, which he thinks is probably the most profound social illusion that we have. Civilization provides a measure for giving up individual pleasures that we're driven to by that pleasure principle, which are rare and intense in feeling, with pleasures that are more predictable but less intense. Therefore, one of the most essential functions of civilization for Freud is the control and the redirection of the pleasure impulse. This reconfiguration of the economy of pleasure not only requires a more egalitarian, equal share of pleasure between all members of a society or culture or civilization, it also forces our inherently selfish ego, which is inwardly driven and inwardly looking, to sort of engage in a state of suspended compromise. But even while civilization might prima facie seem to be the solution for our unhappiness, we still express a subliminal hatred of it, he argues. It infringes upon the liberty and the freedom of the individual ego to act as it wishes to. It places limits on the person's sexual practice through the creation of things like taboos. Why are we not supposed to have sex with our parents? Why are we not supposed to have sex with anyone in our tribe? Whether that means not only your parents but your siblings, very close relatives. What's behind that? Freud would tell you that is one rule that civilization imposes that has become, today it's a taboo to do that. But back then it probably had real evolutionary consequences to stop having sex with people that you were very closely related to and move outside of the tribe and start having exogamous relationships and having children from those. And of course, then, you can start having children that are fully functioning and all of that good stuff. One of the other things that culture does is that it encourages a return of the oppressed, which is this idea that these things that civilization tamps down in us, that tries to control and suppress, will occasionally recur, and they will come up as these sublimated libidinous drives. They'll come up in other forms, sometimes resulting in neuroses, sicknesses. Culture, Freud thinks, manifests itself in the form of the sort of primal father coupling with a mother and providing for her material needs and for the material needs of the children that they have together. It also allows younger, weaker sons to strategically ally with the symbolic strong father figure. And caritas, which I mentioned earlier, I didn't use the word, but it's the Latin word for care or love, which is what Freud uses to refer to our sort of wider love of humanity, is an epiphenomenon of civilization that aids in preventing the pitfalls of exclusive love, exclusive sexual love, of monogamy. So we have this care for a wider set of humanity simply because he thinks that having a singular sexual partner is somehow unstable. As time progresses, it eventually spins, and when I say it, I mean culture, civilization, spins itself into things like ideological origin stories, like the ones, the ancient Sumerian myths, the stories that we read in Genesis about the beginning of the universe, myth, literature, art, music, religion, and other pursuits that we consider to be the sole purview of civilization. However, the important point is that the psychic repression that is demanded of civilization. Remember, civilization wants to sort of tamp down, to crush these individual libidinous impulses and desires that we have. can take this repression that's demanded of civilization can turn into a masochistic way of continually disciplining and punishing the ego. And for those of you who wonder what the consequence of that is, the answer is the superego. And remember, that's one of the three of Freud's parts. The superego is the only part of our personality, according to Freud, which we're not born with. We are born with an id and an ego. The id being the home of the drives, the sexual drives and impulses. The ego being our sort of everyday presentation, our conscious self. The superego, however, which is imposed by civilization, only comes about through the exposure of systematic rules, regulations, mores, folkways, ethical standards, etc., which are imposed on the individual person. And the systematic imposition of those things on someone through organized institutions like the family, education, government, etc., that is what is responsible for the superego. And for those of you who don't know what the superego's function is, that is what keeps the id in check. So while we have the id, which is this sort of broiling center of impulses and libido, the superego is what keeps us from acting on all of those things. So it's kind of like the policeman, the guardian of our psyches. And again, this is all from Freud. I'm not giving you what I think. This is purely for what I have gathered from the text. So, summing up, I was a little concerned that this book, which is really more like an essay, it's right around 100 pages, so if you're interested in reading it, definitely dive in. I thought it would be more steeped in technical Freudian jargon, even more than I think what I'm afraid I might have used above, and I apologize if I use too much of it. I know it can be a little disconcerting. But despite being a late work written when most of the fundamentals of psychoanalysis were already cemented in place, it's really surprisingly readable and even almost charming in places. I think a passing familiarity with some of the ideas that he's talking about, like I said, ego, id, superego, libido, is helpful but not essential, because I think he provides the context as he goes along and explains the ideas as to what these words really mean and what he wants you to take from them. Reading this, I think, for people who love books and aren't just curious about Freud's ideas, will also really be delighted in finding that Freud was himself, perhaps unsurprisingly, a very, very bookish person. Throughout the book, he uses epigrams and quotes especially from poets. He loves his German poets. Especially, I remember him quoting Hölderlin and Goethe several times to illustrate points that he wants to talk about throughout the text. So at 19 minutes, I think I'll wrap this up. A really fascinating book. I gave it 4 out of 5 stars. The 4 out of 5, again, does not reflect how accurate I think the ideas are, but simply their influence on the next, I guess, 90 years of thought, and simply how thought-provoking I thought they were too. And even if Freud is wrong about many things, he never fails to make you scratch your head and think. It is very interesting to read him and then realize how many subsequent critiques of religion are actually just stolen stolen from not necessarily this book, but from Future of Illusion. Because in chapter 1 he goes back and he recaps Future of Illusion. So there you go. I mean, my thoughts on Civilization and Its Discontents by Sigmund Freud. If you have any questions or comments, concerns, ideas, anything like that, go ahead and leave me a comment in the comment section, and I'll get back to you. Until, fingers crossed, next week. Bye, guys.